All right, let's begin our discussion on Islam. So there are a lot of video clips. Probably this lecture has the most video clips than any of the other topics we discussed, and there should be a link to all of the clips that you can watch online below or somewhere very close to this video. I tried to provide the links for you so you can watch all of the links. Some of them could possibly be broken, and if so, try to maybe do a web search for the title or a summary of what the video is about. So this first clip is a French Muslim man who, right after the events in Paris, in France, where there was conflict and violence, he went to the streets, put a blindfold around his face, and held up a sign that said, "I'm a Muslim. I'm told that I'm a terrorist. Do you trust me?" And just stood there for hours. And many Parisians, men, women, children, just went and gave him a hug and supported him, and sent the message that that is, even if there is violence by an extremely small minority, um, and it's unclear what that minority, where they're from, or what the label is, that that's not going to be powerful enough to divide us, and that we can still have peace and live in a world without discrimination and hate. So it's a powerful video. I encourage you to watch that. And one of the messages of it, I think, is captured in this graphic. If all of this blue represents the Muslim population in the world of 1.6 plus billion people, it's the second largest religion in the world if you look at the numbers. Christianity is the most populous religion if you count anyone who identifies as a Christian, Catholic or otherwise. But in the future, this might change. The Muslim population is growing quite quickly, and yeah, those numbers might change. But either way, this is a major world religion in terms of numbers. If you look at, if that 1.6 is represented by all this blue, this ocean of blue, and you see these small little white dots, and a lot of people, because of how much we're bombarded with talk about things like ISIS or Al Qaeda or the Taliban, that is what comes to people's minds, at least in lots of the Western world, including America. And you look at these numbers, such an extremely small percentage of the religion. Al Qaeda, 0.0006%. The Taliban, 0.002%. ISIS, 0.006%. So the problem is too many people think that this is a common way of life of this tradition, and it's just, if you look at the numbers, it just clearly isn't. Here's a symbol of Islam, the crescent moon with the star. It's actually a more recent symbol. It wasn't really sanctioned until the 1950s. It was a symbol for the Ottoman Empire. It was important symbol in Turkey first. It's a very old symbol, but it wasn't officially sanctioned until the 1950s. And you can see it has roots in nature, because it's got got stars and moon, and those are those are things that people, we've seen the star and the moon never, for our whole existence as humanity. So it's a very old symbol, but it was sanctioned as a symbol of Islam in the 1950s. It's the youngest of the major world religions. If we're, so, that word major is quite loaded, isn't it? Like, well, isn't Judaism a major world religion? But if you look at the numbers, there's only 10 or 20 million Jews. So we could talk about what major means for a long time, but at least the traditions we're covering, out of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, out of Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, this tradition is the youngest. It developed in the 7th century CE. Allah means the God. This is the term for God for Muslims. And if you ask Muslims, many, if not the vast majority of them, will say that they worship the same God of the Jews and the Christians. If you ask Christians, a lot of them will say the same thing. If you ask Jews, a lot of them will say the same thing. And if they don't, it might be because of ignorance and not because of the reality of their traditions. The term Muslim itself literally means those who submit to Allah. Of course, a very important city, a very important place for this tradition is the city of Mecca. Mecca is in present-day Saudi Arabia. Mecca and a structure called the Kaaba. Mecca has been an important city historically for a long time because it was on a trade route, on a major caravan route, and there is this stone that's there. It's a very strange stone. It's a black stone, and it's not clear to everyone what it is. Some say that it's a meteoric stone, that it fell from the heavens. Some believe that it predates, well, not some, many people, if we ask the historians, it predates Islam. And some believe that it fell during Adam and Eve's time, and that the Kaaba was built by Abraham and Ishmael. And it was the Prophet Muhammad who purged the Kaaba of the idolatry. So for a while, the Mecca and the Kaaba was controlled by people who were worshiping idols, and some of them were polytheists. So Muhammad comes in and purges the idolatry and reveals the truth for Muslims, which is a strong, devout monotheism, that there's one and only one God, and that's Allah. So here's a picture of Saudi Arabia, and you can see Mecca there. Mecca is a very holy city, and then to the north, another important city, Medina. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Here's an aerial shot of the Kaaba in Mecca, and you can see all that white. Those are people. So this is at night. Very beautiful image. Here are some more. So in that cube-like structure, that's where that meteoric stone is. You can see it's a brick building, shrouded, draped in that kind of black material. So as I said, Islam has roots in the 7th century, and a man named Muhammad is really the central figure here. He has a special relationship with Allah, and was able to be the earpiece. He hears the word of Allah, and is able to transmit it, to disseminate it to the people. So he's born in 570 of the Common Era until 632. So he lives mostly in the 7th century, and it was his tribe that controlled the Kaaba. His mother died before he was 6 years old. So again, we have the death of a mother. Remember, the same kind of story happened for Mahavira and Siddhartha. They lost their mothers. It was before 6, but still at a young age. You don't have statues and stained glass windows and paintings of Muhammad. So here there's an image of Muhammad, but it's blurred out. Same here, and the reason for that is that for this faith, they don't want to have these sorts of images and statues and paintings and stained glass windows that you might see of Jesus in Christianity, because it is potentially a distraction. It's too close to idolatry, because this faith, it's not about Muhammad per se, it's about Allah, it's about God. So, even this blurry image, it could be offensive to many Muslims. There's lots of different ways that Muhammad is spelled in the alphabet that we know. Of course, the Prophet's name, properly written, just like the Quran would be written in Arabic, but here are some of the many spellings. And the Holy Book, the Quran, also is spelled many different ways. So, in these slides, I'll spell it with a Q, but it's spelled other ways too. An important woman in this faith is Khadijah, and she ends up becoming the wife of the Prophet Muhammad. She was married before. She's an older woman. She was 40 years old, and Muhammad was only 25 when they got married. Like I said, she had been married before, so she was a widow, and she was actually very wealthy at the time. She owned a caravan, and some argue that her wealth gave Muhammad free time to ponder religion. And she was the first convert, the first to convert to this new religion. So what happened? Well, an angel appears to Muhammad, the angel Gabriel, and tells Muhammad that there is one and only one God, Allah, and there have been many prophets, but you are the last prophet. You are going to bring to the people not just any revelation, but the complete revelation. So other prophets include Abraham, of course, Moses. Jesus of Nazareth is also considered to be a prophet in Islam. Not God, not the Son of God, not the Savior, but a great figure, a moral person, a leader, a prophet in his tradition. And Muhammad is not God. Muhammad is a man who played a special role, but certainly not God. Muhammad was mortal, just like any other human being. And he didn't explicitly deny the validity of other religions. So now that we've talked about so many different traditions, we can understand most, if not all, the symbols in this this interesting coexist graphic that I've seen made into bumper stickers. So we've got the C, which of course is a symbol of Islam. We have the peace symbol. We've got the symbol for the genders, for men and for women. We've got the Star of David. We've got the pentagram, the five-pointed star, which is a symbol of a very old symbol that you see represented with pagan traditions that associate with nature worship. We've got the yin and the yang, which shows up in Taoism and Confucianism, and of course the cross for Christianity. Three very important cities in this tradition. The most holy, of course, is Mecca. The second is Medina, because that's the burial place of the Prophet Muhammad. And then Jerusalem is a very holy city, because we know that the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount is there, which is close to the Wailing Wall. The central text here, the holy book, is the Quran, which literally means recitation or reading. It was not written by Muhammad, it's the word of God, so the author is Allah, and to truly understand the deep meaning of the Quran, you would have to study Arabic. So that's to properly understand the text, you would need to read it and understand it in Arabic. So Muhammad was almost like a stenographer, like one of those people in a courtroom who just captures everything that's said, and he captured the Word of God. Many consider it to be a supreme act to memorize the entire text. Like other books, it's broken down into chapters and verses. The chapters are also called surahs, and there are 114 of them. And there are 6,000 verses, the ayahs. Surahs and the ayahs. It's traditionally organized from the longest to the shortest chapter. So it's not in chronological order, from the longest chapter to the shortest chapter. Some misconceptions about it. There's some stereotypes, or if you've ever heard about 72 virgins, there's nowhere in the Quran, there's no mentioning of 72 virgins. It's not mentioned at all. There is mentioning of the Huri, which are splendid companions of equal age, so that might be the closest thing you could find. There are some non-Quran texts that talk about 72 virgins, but it's not in the Quran itself. But these Huri could be men or women. The holy day of the week for Muslims, it's not Sunday, it's not Saturday, it's Friday. So we've got Friday, that's the holy day for Muslims. We've got Friday evening, mostly Saturday, that's the holy day for Jews, and for Christians, it's Sunday. What is done on Friday? It's not a day of rest like it is for Jews. It's a day to go to the mosque. A mosque is a place of worship, like a temple or a church, and be with other Muslims and pray. This is the oldest mosque in the world, the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount, and that's in the old city of Jerusalem, a very holy site. Here's another image of it. Leaders of mosques are called imams. So are they like priests? Well, not exactly. They're typically knowledgeable, they're pious, but they're chosen by the community. Priests are selected from the hierarchy above. So there's a leadership role there, so there's some similarity, but it's not exactly the same kind of role. Students ask me, well, what about women? Can women be imams? And it's a religion of a 1.5 billion plus, so you can find female or women imams, but it's going to be really, really rare. The language of the service is typically Arabic, but sometimes it's in the language of the community, if not in Arabic. One of the most important aspects of this tradition are what is known as the 5 pillars of Islam. So here they are. We'll talk about each of them individually, but here they all are on one slide. Repetition of the creed, daily prayer, almsgiving, fasting during the holy month of Ramadan, and of course the pilgrimage to Mecca. So let's go through each of these. Number 1, the repetition of the creed, which is also called the Shahada. So remember, I'll try to have the phonetic spelling there, and if there's a syllable that's capitalized, that's where you want to put the stress, the shahada. So the creed is, here's the English translation: there is no God but Allah, Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. So that is repeated. You hear it at birth, you hear it at death. And many will say that if you say this and you truly believe it, that's all it takes. That would make you a Muslim. If you say this and believe it, then that's all that really matters. So that's the Shahada, the repetition of the creed. Another pillar is the Salat, the daily prayer. So that happens 5 times a day, at dawn, at midday, mid-afternoon, sunset, and nightfall. And traditionally, there are these men who are known as muezzins, and they are often strong-voiced men who cry out atop towers that it's time to pray. They're men who announce it's prayer time. And if the prayer is done in a mosque, the preparation is to cleanse the hands and feet. So shoes will be removed. There have been times where they're in a desert, right? They're in present-day Saudi Arabia and other places, so they might use sand if they were out of water. That's kind of a neat, interesting kind of side aspect. Do men and women pray together? Well, traditionally they're separated, and some mosques are men only. There's this really fascinating, great television show. It's a Canadian television show called Little Mosque on the Prairie, and if you have a Hulu account, you can watch every episode of the entire series. And there's an episode about men and women, and a debate about should there be a barrier between the men and women? Should they pray separately? Should the women pray behind the men? And I'll say more about it at the end of this presentation, but it's a pretty good show, and it depicts Muslims living in Canada, in a conservative part of Canada, kind of like the Middle America version of the United States. And it's a small Muslim community in a very Christian majority area that's conservative, and these people that are just trying to be faithful, and the struggle when there's Islamophobia and misconceptions and discrimination, and how it's a comedy though, and it's about their plight. Even their mosque, they're such a small community and they don't have that many resources, so their mosque is essentially in the basement of a Christian church that they have to rent out. Okay, so here are some men that are participating in prayer. And, part of getting down on hands and knees is about reverence, right? You're bowing down and showing reverence and respect for the awesomeness of God or Allah. Third pillar is the zakat, which is almsgiving. So this is helping out those who are less fortunate, helping out those who are in need. You're sharing your possessions. You're giving to charity, for example, to the poor, widows, orphans, whoever's in need. Sometimes it's assessed as a tax. It might be 2.5% of what you make, maybe 10%. And that goes to keep the community going. The fourth pillar is fasting, the Psalm. And we can draw a parallel to Judaism and Christianity. The month is the holy month of Ramadan. And this floats around the calendar because it's the lunar calendar. So sometimes it's in the fall or spring, and sometimes it's in the summer, which is particularly difficult because you're supposed to abstain from eating, drinking, smoking, and sexual intercourse during daylight hours. So if it's in June, when we have the most daylight, that can be 14 plus hours of fasting. So there'll be a big meal before the sun rises, and then that's it. No more eating or drinking anything really with calories in it until it gets dark again. Of course, there are exceptions. If you're sick, or if you're traveling, or if you are a young mother with nursing an infant, or you're a small kid, they're exempt from this. And the idea is this kind of cleanses you and you get a fresh start. You get forgiveness of sins. So the first bullet point, similar to Judaism and Christianity, we have Yom Kippur, which is the Jewish Day of Atonement. There's also fasting during that and reflection. And then Lent, the 40-day period before Easter, or before the important part of Easter week. There's fasting, or there's a tradition of kind of giving up certain foods or indulgences. After Ramadan, there's a celebration, a 3-day feast. And that leads us to the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. Every Muslim should go to Mecca, should take the Hajj, make the pilgrimage if they can afford it. So the ask is to go at least once in your life. Over 15 million people travel there every year. Non-Muslims technically are prohibited from entering the city, although it's not as if there's a religious test for every one of them. So students ask me, well, couldn't you wear hijab if you're a woman and kind of get in? I'm sure that's happened. Here's some common sayings in Islam. Remember the muezzin who would call people to prayer. You might hear in a very singing voice, Allahu Akbar, and that's a call to prayer. Many Muslims will use the phrase inshallah, which is God willing. So let's take this flight to go to the East Coast, and you might say inshallah, which is God willing. After the mentioning of the Prophet's name, Muhammad, many Muslims will say, may peace and blessings be upon him, or they'll say the version in Arabic. In printed text, you might see this parenthetic initialization or acronym after the Prophet's name. So you might see PBUH, or you might see SAW or SAWS. So that is, peace be upon him. That's just the initialization of that saying. And then the SAW or SAWS, that's the acronym for the Arabic version of may Allah's peace and blessings be upon him. You might also, so the call to prayer, Allahu Akbar, also has the meaning of God is great. Let's talk about women in Islam. Before Islam, were women treated better or worse? Well, actually, they were treated worse. Muhammad, as he is the leader of this new faith, he bans infanticide, and at the time, many men had multiple wives, and he reforms the rules about that, and he'll say, no, you can't have endless amount of wives. You can't be like King Solomon and have hundreds of wives. You can have a maximum of 4, but there's a rule. You have to be able to treat them with respect and support all of them. You got to be able to treat them equally. So in many parts of the world, men and women are 100% equal in Islam, and a lot of people are surprised by that, even though you might say, I don't know why they should be. In many Muslim majority countries like Malaysia or Indonesia, there have been women who have been elected heads of state. And of course, what you hear about a lot are countries where there's a lot of subordination. So, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, women are not allowed to work or study with men, or work or study at all. People always hear about in Saudi Arabia, women aren't allowed to drive. There are dress requirements. We'll talk about hijab later in this lecture. And there have been abuses of the tradition and of the text and of the Quran. There have been stonings of women who are not dressed appropriately or believed to who are believed to have committed adultery. The Taliban is mostly in Afghanistan. Al Qaeda is worldwide, and Bin Laden, he was the head of that group, right, until his death. But really, both are really, really extreme, radical groups. And again, I show you this image. A few months or years ago, there was this viral video about this woman in New York City. So this is one of the links I have under this video about a woman in New York City, and you can see she's wearing just jeans and a t-shirt, and she walks silently the streets of New York City for 10 hours, and then they edit it down to a few minutes, and you can see that she gets a lot of harassment from people on the street. So she gets catcalled, right? People, you can watch the video, and some of it seems kind of humorous. Sometimes it's scary. You know, sometimes they say it seems pretty harmless. Sometimes it's, you know, very, very foul. So it was 10 hours and 108 catcalls. Well, it's an open question. So this woman, she's being silent. She's not saying anything. So so these men who are catcalling to her really are not acting respectfully, are they? In no way is this woman asking for this kind of attention, right? Well, some would argue that what you wear can send a message to people. And so, yeah, she's wearing ordinary clothes, but these are ordinary American clothes, right? So although it's just have jeans and t-shirt, there's nothing sexy about that. It's not like a low-cut dress that's very revealing, you know, showing cleavage or, you know, very, very tight. But at the same time, jeans and a t-shirt in America can be very form-fitting, right? So, you know, American men mostly don't wear tops that are that tight. You know, skinny jeans are kind of in, but, you know, women's jeans have always been form-fitting. Not always, but many of them have been form-fitting. So you could say that this woman isn't being modest in her dress. Now, of course, that doesn't give people license to do the things they do in this video, but I leave it to you as just something to think about as if a woman dressed differently, like the woman does in the next video, who wears a burqa, which is related to the concept of hijab, which is being modest and kind of protecting that external part of a woman that draws sexual attention. So like your hair, for instance, is you know, part of a woman's sexuality. Curves are part of a woman's sexuality. And so the hijab, which can be interpreted as wearing this attire, a burqa, which this woman's wearing in this image, that can be a manifestation of going along with that concept. So in this YouTube video, there's kind of like an experiment where one time she's wearing jeans and a t-shirt, she gets lots of that same sort of attention as the woman before. Then same person, different clothes, wearing the burqa, and she gets no attention. So you can see, you can kind of, I mean, this makes me think of an analogy to bullying in school. You know, so you've got a kid who, let's say you have a kid who wears a dress. You have a boy who wears a dress. Maybe the boy identifies as transgender and wants to wear a dress to school, and then gets bullied and gets beat up, right? And someone might say, well, the kid asked for it. He was wearing a dress, right? That line of reasoning seems very wrong-headed, right? So if the school is going to intervene, if the teachers and the principal and the administrators are going to intervene, it should be to talk to the bully, and the kid who wears a dress shouldn't have to change who he is or who she is. right? We should take action to change the behavior and actions of the bully. But what the school might do is they might say, there's a rule, boys cannot wear dresses because it causes problems. But don't you see that seems to, that gives the bully a pass. That's almost sending the message to the bully, it wasn't, well, you don't have to change. The kid who got bullied has to change. It's sending the wrong message. It's kind of the same thing here, is that women want to wear what they want. They're free. We're Americans. Free speech, and part of that free speech is what you choose to wear. And if that causes quote unquote problems, we shouldn't go to say the woman and say you've got to change. We should go to the bully, or in this case the catcaller, and reprimand them. But so that's one side. The other side is just from a practical standpoint. If the little boy stops wearing a dress, there will be less bullying. And if the woman dresses more modestly, and maybe taking that to extreme, wearing the hijab or the burqa, there will be less problems. So just in a practical, like if you just want the problem to go away, this is the solution. But I still think there's something wrong with, we shouldn't force the victim to change their behavior. The attention's got to be on the aggressor. But it's just, I don't really have an answer to this issue or to this question. I just want you as a student just to think about where do you think? What do you think about this? Watch these 2 videos. And if you are a woman, or or if you have a daughter, or if you plan to have a daughter, if you have sisters, we all have these relationships to women, whether or not we are one, or we have moms and sisters and friends who are women. So yeah, think about that. Okay, so again, hijab is about modesty, and it's about privacy. So here's a line from the Quran, chapter 24, verse 31. And say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty. So you shouldn't make eyes at a man if you're a woman, right? You should, don't be all flirty. Guard your modesty. So you shouldn't wear revealing clothing. You should, you have a sexuality, and that needs to be reserved for your husband and not for public. They should not display their beauty and ornaments. So part of the ornaments are curves, bosoms, anything that has sex appeal. And, it's just within reason, except what must ordinarily appear. So you don't have to wear, like a giant sheet over you. You can have your hands can be exposed, like your eyes, right? Maybe like your mouth and your nose. But you should draw a khimar, a piece of cloth, over their bosoms and not display their beauty. So hijab is interpreted in many different ways. So the burqa is one way. You might see that in Saudi Arabia and Iran. Right. So just think about this in terms of attraction, and if 2 young people are looking for potential relationships, this isn't going to catch a man's eye, and that's the intention, and that's part of the intention. So maybe one of the most extreme interpretations of hijab is the shadri, which you might see in Afghanistan. So that's really, complete covering of anything. But, these are more the exceptions. Many women who wear a hijab, they might look like this. So they'll wear a headscarf. And maybe you or other students that at our college, there are many Muslims in our community, and you might be a part of this community, or you might know or see someone, and they're wearing the headscarf, and that's a good chance that if they're Muslim, that this is their interpretation of hijab. There's a debate about whether or not women are being forced to cover up, or if it's their own free decision. Now, even an American Muslim who might say I'm independent, maybe will say I'm a feminist and is a woman. There still can be cases where no one's forcing you to do something, but there's still the societal, cultural, religious pressure, or maybe you have internalized something so much that even though it seems like you're doing it out of your own free will, really there's a deep-seated inculcation that's leading to this behavior. That's something that you might want to think about. So here's a woman who's saying, look, this is not men forcing me to do something. This is the way that I express my faith. It's my choice. It's not compulsion. It's not forced. There was a story recently about a Muslim student who wanted to wear hijab at a graduation ceremony who was trained at the Citadel. So that's an American military school. And the Citadel says, no, you can't wear that. You have to. It's not uniform. You can't wear that. And you can see this is a clash between tradition or rules with, you signed up for this military thing, so you got to follow our rules. So the right of a school to have rules and enforce them versus freedom of religious expression. In France has been particularly harsh on religious expression. And so, there might be places in France where the burqa is outlawed because France just sees it as the oppression of women. So it's tough. You don't want the oppression of women, but at the same time you want religious freedom, and it can be hard. It can be a juggling act to balance both of those. So in Cannes, or however this is a very difficult French city to pronounce, look, Cannes, some people pronounce it Cannes. There was, at least for a little bit, I think it was lifted, but there was a ban on full-body bathing suits, which some call burkinis, so bathing suits that are burqas at beaches. Now look at the two perspectives here. So an American woman might say, oh my gosh, these poor women, they're so oppressed. They can't be themselves. And so the American woman say, oh my gosh, everything is covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture that controls her. But then the Muslim woman might say, well, even though you're freely choosing this skimpy bikini, isn't it really the pressure from society, which has traditionally been male-dominated? So the Muslim woman might look at the woman in bikini like, oh my gosh, in one sense, you're forced or coerced in another way, a societal way, to kind of do what men want. So nothing, instead of everything covered but our eyes, nothing covered but our eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture, you could say. So again, I don't have the answer to who's right, if any of these two sides are right. But again, what do you think about these two perspectives? And does the American woman depicted in this comic have a point? What about the Muslim woman? Recently at the 2016 Games in Rio, the Summer Olympics, there was a beach volleyball tournament, and this powerful image was taken of the Egyptian beach volleyball team versus the German beach volleyball team up at the net, and they're almost like a mirror image, and you can really see the difference in this quote-unquote Western culture their uniform is very, very scantily clad, very, very revealing, versus the beach volleyball uniform for the woman from Egypt, who I'm assuming is a Muslim woman. And even she's like, I'm an athlete, but I'm also a Muslim, so I want to play this sport. But even though everyone else is wearing bikinis, you can play beach volleyball without a bikini. Men don't wear bikinis. You can certainly wear a shirt. You can totally cover up. So what do you think? Who has more freedom here? You might say, oh well, this woman's father and her religion, clearly influenced her life decisions, and is that really what you would want to wear? Yeah, maybe not, maybe yes. But then look at the bikini. Do women really want to wear a lot of these clothes, like high heels and spending the time on the makeup and hair? It's a lot of time consuming. Is this what women really, really want, or is it part of the expectations of a society that traditionally has a lot of influence by men? And it wasn't that long ago that in America or in the Western world that women were reprimanded for wearing skimpy clothes. So this is just about 100 years ago. Here's a woman who, so this bathing suit was believed to be scandalous because it was way too revealing. And this was a woman who was an athlete, and she wanted to swim the English Channel. She was going to swim for a long time, hours and hours. And to do this, she couldn't wear the bathing costumes at the time because it'd be too much drag. So she needed a more form-fitting, svelte bathing suit. And on one report, this woman was arrested in Boston for wearing that. Imagine if you went to the beach. Imagine you go to Santa Cruz or some close by beach, and you're a woman and you wear that bathing suit and you get arrested because you're showing too much skin. That sounds ridiculous. That you might say, oh, that might happen in like Saudi Arabia or Iran. That happened in Boston. That happened in the United States. It was in the past, but it happened in the West, quote unquote West. Some other decisions by many Muslim women: they decide not to shake the hands or hug adult men that they're not related to or they're not married to. So again, this open question, you think about it. Is this free expression of religion? Is this the freedom of women to make decisions for what's best for them? Or is this some kind of internalized sexism? Here are a couple American Muslim women who talk about their modesty and their decision to not touch men that are adults, that are not their husbands, and that they're not related to. And it's a long video. You might not have to watch all of it, but you get the sense. And they also use some of those phrases, some of those Islamic phrases that we talked about before, like God willing, or saying may peace be upon him after saying the prophet's name. So just kind of ordinary American women and kind of their experience. And one of them, didn't wear hijab, didn't cover their hair, didn't cover their head before, and had relationships before they practiced in this way. And there was, it's tough, because this one of the women, I think her name's Rebecca, the two, she works with children at a school, and these parents, well-intentioned, well-meaning parents who really are thankful for, this woman working with their kids. And, parents want to give a handshake or give a hug. We're very touchy-feely in some parts of the United States. And, there's a clash of culture there in a sense, because that is really what this woman just decided that she's not going to do. So what's going on here with these countries outside the United States and these rules, and how oppressive are they? Well, you can see in Saudi Arabia and Iran, so these are the purple countries. You can also see Afghanistan and Iraq, where Sharia law, so Sharia is a set of rules that, if followed to the letter, can be very, very strict. And then you have countries where this law is not as strictly enforced, and those are the yellow ones. So India, Northern Africa, where this law applies, it may be in personal life, not public life, but in issues of marriage, divorce, child custody. But then you have these countries that are orange, like Malaysia and Indonesia, where you can have various interpretations of Sharia. And it turns out that the vast majority of Muslims live outside of the Middle East. I'll say that again. The vast majority of Muslims live outside the Middle East. Because there's so many Muslims in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in places like Indonesia and Malaysia, that they outnumber the ones who are in the Middle East. That's where the largest concentration is. So here's an article. This was in the LA Times, about, sometimes things get more strict than what some people would like, about public dress restrictions. So I just was visiting my family in Orange County, and I was reading the newspaper, LA Times, and I saw this article, and I said I'm going to put this in the lecture because this is current news, and I think my students find this interesting. So this is December 27th, 2014, and this is in Indonesia, so a particularly strict part of Indonesia, the city of Muelaba, in a district called Aceh. So Muelaba, the capital of West Aceh district, has one of the strictest regimens for enforcing Sharia law. Public dress restrictions go beyond the requirement that women wear headscarves. In December, clerics in West Aceh went around spraying red paint on women's pants that were deemed too tight. Imagine that, if you're walking around in public and the police go up to you and they spray red paint on your pants. Too tight. And other locals in Aceh have banned women from dancing. That's too sexual. The idea is you shouldn't be flaunting your sexuality, and that goes against a religion or God. And you can kind of see there's some point there that flaunting sexuality can get people into trouble, right? That's where you get premarital sex, or you get you're putting yourself in danger for assault, or maybe being too sexual, if you think that if you can be too sexual. Other locals in Aceh have banned women from dancing, or now this is the one that when I read this line, I was like, I'm going to put this in the slides because it's so fascinating. So no dancing or riding a motorbike in a straddled position, right? Oh, you're straddling a motorbike. It's too sexual. That's a no-no. Yeah. Now, this is, again, it's interesting, and maybe even by posting this, I'm misrepresenting the faith. That certainly could be the case. And to be clear, many Muslim scholars would totally denounce these restrictions. And many of them would say, this is not truly Muslim. This is not what Allah wants. This is instead human beings who've taken the religion and twisted it for their own personal gain. So that's a fair perspective. If there is extremism, one potential explanation is the overnight wealth that was discovered in parts of the Middle East. So for instance, there were these countries that weren't particularly wealthy, and Western countries didn't have as strong a relationship with them. And then all of a sudden, oil is discovered, and they become wealthy overnight in the 1960s and 70s. And of course, countries then are going to be interested in trade, at least. And so imagine if you are from a country, you're from a culture that's more traditional. And then almost overnight, because of this wealth, because of this now fast-moving relationship with Western countries or other Western countries, there are all these changing. And there's all this building and structure and westernization. And you grew up and you were like, I'm happy with this maybe slower paced, more traditional values of my culture. And so there can be a pushback. And that might be one of the reasons for extremism, including Wahhabi, which is, you can see here, Wahhabi schools teach you that people are basically on two sides. The Wahhabis, who are the winners, the chosen ones, who will go to heaven, and the rest are even Muslims and Christians and Jews and others. So that kind of, you got to be in this tight circle, traditional circle, and if you're not, then you're in the out group. But this is clearly not representative. If you look at women in Indonesia and Pakistan, except for maybe those certain areas that I talked about in the LA Times article, men and women are equal. They have total gender equality, and like I said, in some of these countries, women have been heads of state. They've been president or prime minister. In Pakistan and Indonesia, there's been a woman head of state, and in the United States, still, we've never elected a woman president. It seemed like we got close when we got the popular vote, but we still have not elected a woman president. You can see in this CNN interview, this clip went viral. This is Dr. Reza Aslan, who who really makes these two CNN commentators look pretty foolish, because they're bringing up, they're basically saying, yeah, but in Saudi Arabia women can't drive. Oh, in Iran, women have to have these just requirements. Oh, in Hezbollah, they're painting red on the bottoms, or they get arrested for riding a motorcycle. And what Reza's point is, this is a religion of 1.5 billion people, and you cannot paint all of them with the same brush. You can't look at these small pockets and think that this is representative. And when you do that, it's like looking at that giant sea of blue, that big blue that I showed you a couple times. And instead of looking at that, you're looking at these dots and trying to generalize. But what we don't realize is that those dots are not representative, not even close to being representative. And so when he's just straight up asks, does Islam provoke violence? He says Islam does not. It doesn't go either way. It depends on your version of it. Men and women and people and human beings can take a religion, they can use it any way they want. And if you bring violence into it, then you'll have a violent Islam. Same thing with Christianity. In Burma, which is also known as Myanmar, there are Buddhist monks who have the power, and they are taking advantage and being brutally violent against the Muslims, who are the minority in that country. They don't have, or maybe they're the majority in terms of people, but they don't have the power. And so there have been refugees from Burma. I actually know one personally who moved to California because of the violence in Burma or Myanmar. And those are the Buddhists, right? So you don't think of Buddhism as a particularly violent religion. And so here's the Dalai Lama, who argues that these terms are very misleading, and they're actually contradiction in terms. Buddhist terrorists, Muslim terrorists, the wording is wrong, because the second you engage in violence, you no longer are a member of that faith. The point here is, you can act in such a way that it invalidates you as a member of that religion. You're no longer part of that religion. So you could say that those little dots in that sea of blue, they aren't Muslims. And so if you go that way, then then no Muslim has been violent, because the second they go that direction, they're no longer Muslim. So it's not an Islamic saying. When political candidates talk about jihadists, we'll talk about the concept jihad in a little bit. But when they say jihadic terrorism, that it's a really loaded, unfair term, and that you could say, no, there's no problem with Islam and violence, because no Muslims are violent. The second they are, there's something else. So the problem is just people who are oppressed, desperate, impoverished, and it's their circumstances that has led to this behavior, and we need to look more at the cause than at the results. You might see many Muslim men who are covering their heads, and they might grow out their facial hair. Maybe they'll shave their mustache. Well, the head covering is one name for that garment is the taqiyya. People talk about turbans, and they say, oh, these Muslims are wearing the turbans. But when we talked about Sikhism, we learned that it's Sikhs who wear turbans, and it's just a misconception. People get confused. It's not really Muslims who wear turbans. It's a very, very good chance you're talking about a Sikh. So this dress, the growing out of this beard in this way and the shaving of the mustache, it's not required by the Quran. So you could say, look, I'm strictly following the Quran and not wear your hair like that. There might be parts of this text that's called the hadith, or the hadiths, which are believed to be words of the Prophet. It's distinct from the Quran. And there you might read about beard and shaved mustache, and it's really paying homage to the Prophet Muhammad, because it's believed that that's how he wore his hair. So you're kind of like, well, I'm just going to kind of be like him in many ways. There are rules, there are taboos about what foods can't be eaten. So, for example, just like Judaism, pork, can't have any pork products, so no bacon, no pork sausage. You can't have, this is less common, but birds or beasts of prey, so that might be like a donkey or a mule or like an eagle or something, but that's not something that's common around here, at least. Muslims are not allowed to drink any alcohol. And I think the idea is, if you're a devout Muslim, the faith can help you with restraint and discipline, and it can help you avoid temptation. You see, if women are wearing revealing clothing and men are drinking, this leads to the temptation gets so great it leads to problems. That might be some of the thinking. Not allowed to gamble. So these things are not halal. Halal means permissible, legal, and so maybe kosher might be a Jewish kind of version of halal. And if something is forbidden or taboo, that is haram. So that group that you might have heard about on the news, Boko Haram, literally means that the ways of the West are forbidden. Haram is forbidden. Let's talk about the concept of jihad. It's too often translated as holy war. That is not the meaning of jihad. The real meaning is struggle in the path of or for God. So when you're trying to be a devout Muslim and you're struggling with that, that's an example of jihad. Some people interpreted the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein as Saddam Hussein's jihad. But Muslim scholars would say, no, that's not a jihad at all. That's twisting the religion for selfish reasons. The acts of Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden, calling them jihadists, is really unfair and not a proper use of the term, or at least many Muslim and religious scholars would say as much. So, like the flying plane, commandeering, hijacking planes, flying them into buildings, that's not an act of jihad. Maybe they believed that they were struggling in the path of God, but they weren't from an objective perspective. They were doing something immoral. So jihad has to be something moral. Do you see? It has to be something moral. So calling these people jihadists is, you could say, well, they might believe that they are jihadists, but objectively they're not. So it's like calling Hitler and the Nazis thought that they were fighting for what's right. So it's like calling them freedom fighters. Well, they might have believed they were fighting for freedom, but to call them freedom fighters is very, very misleading. So what are real examples of jihad? Well, the struggle of that community in a little mosque on the Prarie, trying to build and maintain a mosque in a community that can be discriminatory and that is majority Christian, that could be an example of a jihad. Leaving home to spread the word about the Prophet Muhammad, that could be an act of jihad. Avoiding persecution could be jihad. An armed struggle where there's violence could be jihad, but it has to be defense. If you have a Muslim community who's being attacked, if the innocent of the community are being attacked and killed by an outside group, then you could act in self-defense to protect your faith, your family, the children. That could be a jihad. So like when during the Christian Crusades, when the Crusaders used violence, they believed that they were taking back land and protecting their religion. But if you were defending against that sort of violence, resistance to the Crusades, that could be considered a jihad. Anytime you're really struggling against the human passions or human temptation, that could be an example of jihad. Let's talk about the Crusades for a second, because we didn't really talk about that much when we covered Christianity. They were religiously sanctioned military campaigns from the 11th to 13th century, and their goal was to restore Christian control of the Holy Land. Crusaders were promised a guarantee to heaven. So it's kind of there's very similar story where you can get people to die for a religion if you convince them that there will be some reward. You see how this is a perversion and a twisting of the faith. And there was death toll in the millions. Maybe almost 10 million people died in the crusade. You probably have heard about the conflict in Palestine and Israel. So many people, many scholars believe that there are people in their areas in the Middle East, in an area that many call Palestine, where there's an occupation of Palestine by the country of Israel. So I got some videos on that, but just mull that over. Before we get to that, we have to talk about the spread of Islam. So there's a high concentration, of course, in Indonesia, Malaysia, as I mentioned. So that was in the 15th century. You get Northern Africa. It's also in Europe and North America. So the next link for this lecture shows in just minutes the spread of Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So it's quite fascinating to watch things kind of change and watch all the colors. There's a link there for you to watch that. There are major groups within this faith. One of them Sunni and one of them Shia. The vast majority of Muslims in the world are Sunni, around 85%. And that group is actually more conservative. The Shia, they are a smaller group, so about 15% of the Muslim world population. They get their name from the Alids. So Shia Muslims believe that Muhammad named this man named Ali, who was his cousin, to be the successor of Islam. And so these followers of Ali were known as the Alids, and that became Shia Ali and then just Shia. Many Sunni Muslims, they don't believe the story about Muhammad naming his cousin Ali the successor of Islam. So there can be conflict between these two groups because there's a difference of belief. And this is a belief that's very fundamental. So if you've ever heard the term sectarian violence, this can be these groups fighting amongst each other. This is not unlike what happened in Northern Ireland, where you had Catholics and Protestants fighting against each other. Sunnis believe that imams are just community leaders. However, Shia, at least many Shia, believe that imams speak with the authority of God. There are many Shia in Iran and Iraq. And you can see from this map here, so there's the red, Iran and Iraq. And that green, Malaysia, Indonesia, Northern Africa, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Afghanistan. That's where there's large concentrations of Sunni. That small blue is a sect that developed before both, 20 years after Muhammad, called Ibadi. So that's a small little group that's there just southeast of Saudi Arabia. In Iraq, you've got many different groups. So you can see you've got the Shia who are in the south and in the southeast. And then you've got Sunni, who are in kind of the west, midwest, northwest. And in the north, you have the Kurds, who are counted as Sunni sometimes. So you have sometimes conflict among these groups in Iraq. So that's part of the problem is after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, who do we leave in power? Well, whoever we leave in power, that's going to make some of the people unhappy, because if it's a Sunni leader, that's going to make the Shia community unhappy. If it is a Shia leader, that's going to make the Sunni, whatever the opposite of what I said before is. Remember, Iraq, the majority is Shia, and so I believe that at one point, maybe still now, the leader was Sunni, and so that was not making the people very happy. And that's Syria. You can see there's a conflict in Syria. This is all related to the problems going on there, which of course very complicated and a very long history. Here's one group, Sufi Muslim, and very fascinating tradition here with the wearing of this dress, the covering of the head with these interesting hat of sorts, and here you can see them spinning. The belief is that knowledge of God is possible through mystical experience, and that's one of their traditions to kind of trigger this mystical experience. You can participate in this ceremony. And this is similar to asceticism in Buddhism and Jainism, mostly Jainism, that you can physiologically trigger the spiritual. So here's some holidays or holy days in Islam. You have the Feast of Fast Breaking, of course, that's up to 3 days after the month of Ramadan. So after this month of struggling to fast and abstaining from food and drink and cigarettes and sexual intercourse, then you have kind of a celebration for 3 days. You have the Feast of Sacrifice. Remember when we talked about Judaism, there's a story where where God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, right? And then in the end, the angel comes and says, no, God says, don't do that. Sacrifice this lamb instead. Well, there's a story like that in Islam, but instead of Isaac being the one who's almost sacrificed, it is Isaac's brother Ishmael. And Muhammad is believed to be a descendant of Ishmael. Jesus is believed to be a descendant of Isaac. So isn't that just fascinating that these half brothers, same father, Abraham's the father, different mothers. It all goes back to that. So that's celebrated by the head of household killing an animal for a feast by some. There's been a lot of stuff in the news in the last months and years about politics and Islam. So before Trump was elected president, he went on record arguing that Muslims should carry a special ID. That scared the crap out of a lot of people because it sounded a lot like the badges that Jews were forced to wear many times historically, not the least of which was during Nazi Germany rule. Jeb Bush ran for president in 2015 and 16 in the Republican primary. Of course, he lost. But there was debate about what to do with these Syrian refugees. There were all these people who were dying. A lot of them were families and children and women, and they're these refugees. And some people were saying, we got to help these people out. And these Republicans saying, yeah, but what if like an ISIS person sneaks in, pretends to be a refugee? And so no refugees allowed. But then they said, well, what about the ones who are Christians and they're being persecuted? Okay, Jeb Bush says, well, let them in. But how are you supposed to tell who's a Christian and who's not? How do you prove? And Jeb Bush didn't seem to give a satisfactory answer for many. Ben Carson also ran for president. Of course, he lost that the nomination, in the Republican Party, and he is on record of thinking that we shouldn't have a Muslim president. He thinks that faith is incompatible with the Constitution. Of course, legalistically, that's just patently false. maybe if you kind of said, well, what he meant was kind of a value thing, I guess, but that's probably just a discriminatory perversion of the religion. This happened much more recently. So you've got this Muslim man who he came in 2010. He was an Iraqi refugee, and he was on a plane. And it's a Southwest Airlines, so that's kind of our in the West. It's a prominent airline. Many of you have heard of it or been on Southwest flights. He gets kicked off the plane because he says inshallah, which means God willing, right? Inshallah. Wow. Inshallah. She's saying inshallah, and he's just saying God willing. And you could tell people saying, oh my gosh, there's a person who looks Arab and they're speaking in this strange language. You can tell that people's emotion, when there's fear involved, people end up doing very discriminatory things. After Orlando, President Obama gave a speech, and he wanted to make it clear that we're not at war with Islam. He echoed the words of President Bush after 9/11, and that we can't let this break our spirit. We can't let this lead to acts of hate and more violence. We have to, or otherwise the people who do things like what happened in Orlando or San Bernardino, they win. So it's a powerful address. Here, I think this is another link where you've got the famous line from Trump. We'll see if he, as president-elect or as president, changes his ways here. But here's the line where he calls, in so many words, a ban of Muslims entering the United States until Congress can figure out what the hell is going on. That seems to be blatantly unconstitutional, and why a lot of people just couldn't imagine voting for him. This is a long, so this is not terribly long, 4.5 minutes, but if you're interested in more background on Iraq and ISIS and Syria and the war and what caused what and what are the players and the interests, that's a good video clip to explain that. So we don't have to talk about that in this section here, but if you're interested, that's a good source. This clip's really hard to watch. So you have a Muslim man who's trying to build a mosque in a community where the majority seems to be Christian, and you get someone here who's very angry, very upset, and just says every Muslim is a terrorist, period, shut your mouth. You can see very ignorant, hard to hear that, and you can see part of the reason why people have the sentiment is because the faith is just, if you're watching the news, you hear just in a short period of time those two things together, Muslim and violence, Muslim and terrorists, and it's unfortunate. Even this lecture, I really struggle actually with this lecture because I've spent a lot of time kind of saying, trying to clear up misconceptions. But at the same time, when we were covering Hinduism or when we were covering Judaism, we didn't talk about terrorism. We talked Christianity, we didn't talk about terrorism. So even in this effort to rectify the misconceptions, there's still kind of this, the religion is talked about in close proximity with these acts. And so, maybe in the future I'll when I redo these slides pretty consistently, maybe in the future I won't say anything about violence, and I'll just talk about the beliefs itself, and maybe that'll be the way to go. So again, people worry about this threat. We really have to protect ourselves and protect our borders and worry about refugees. But if you look at the numbers, if you set aside fear, just look at the numbers, violence from quote-unquote radical Muslims, it's just not, it's not something we should really be afraid of, because the injuries and death from them is so small. And if you look at, you know, deaths from white supremacists, they cause more death. White supremacists cause more threat. They're a bigger threat than radical Muslims. But that's not where people's fears are, because our country has a lot of white people in it. And here's an image of that show that I recommend to you, Little Mosque. You might not be able to watch it. You might need a subscription to Hulu. I'm not requiring you that you do that, but well done. It's produced and directed by a diverse group of people. Many of them are Muslims. Many of the actors are Muslims. So I think you get a good insight into what it's like being just kind of an ordinary, everyday Muslim. And so we'll conclude our discussion there.